Janet McTeer, you play Jacquetta Woodville, mother of the woman who would become Queen of England in The White Queen. How familiar were you with the history of behind this story of the War of the Roses before you signed on for the miniseries?
Relatively, as much as in as much as I think one of the reasons why Philippa liked to write about these particular women is that they're not quite as well known as quite a lot of the other women in history. So I mean, even though I know about the women and I have read about the women, it's so complicated. Who's married to whom? Who was married to whom? Who was descended from whom? Who then married somebody else? They're all second, and everyone's called Henry or Edward. It's very difficult. So I'm more or less kind of au fait with the time. And of course, there've been so many. I personally really enjoy history, the history of my world, which is England, and the history of. I'm less clever about the history of other countries than I am about England, but so half and half, put it that way.
Yeah, I did notice what you were saying when watching the miniseries about, if this were a made-up story, I'm guessing an author wouldn't have named everyone Margaret, Henry, or Edward. But it's still
absolutely
fairly
we said that at the time, and it was all so complicated that in the end, in the makeup bus, we had them write down there was a long sort of family tree, so that you could go, wait a minute, who is he to me? Okay, he's my seventh cousin, twice removed, once by my brother's father's sister. It was a very small world. There weren't that many people.
Did you study the real Jacquetta specifically before you prepared for the role in order to prepare?
Yes, absolutely. As much as you can. She's a kind of she's interesting in as much as she was one of the most powerful women at court for a very long time, and she was present at several of the most important moments in that period of time. And yet there's not a lot written about her because people didn't write about women very much. And women who were very clever wielded their power behind the men, which is exactly what she did. She was but there are certain facts, and from those facts you can glean certain things. For example, she was extremely well liked. Whenever she is mentioned in history, it's always with praise. She was clearly a very liked person. She was a very loyal person. She married for love. These things are facts, and so from those you can glean a certain amount of things. I mean, they were an incredibly political family. They didn't really have much choice given the time that they lived in, given their world that they lived in. They either could go away into somewhere where nobody would see them and have a farm and cope, or they could attempt to survive in the world in which they were born, which was, in her time, the world of royalty. She was married off at a very young age. She didn't really have much choice. So once she was in that world, you can see just by the facts that we know to be true, which are very few, that she survived. She used whatever power she had, and she is the matron, as it were. She's the matriarch of, to the present day, the first ancestor, as it were. Her bloodline runs through to the royal family today. She knew what she was doing. She was a clever woman.
Yeah, since Jacquetta isn't one of the most well-known figures in history and not the most written about, as an actor, was that helpful for you or challenging to be able to come into this role and fill in some of those blanks yourself?
It was fun. I think there are different challenges coming into something that you know more about the people or less about the character. And in this particular thing, as I've said, really, the thing that I mostly really hung on to was the fact that she survived. She was a Lancastrian, then she was a Yorkist. She was married politically, then she married for love, and somehow she stayed right at the top of the tree for her entire career, until she died. And and she was tried for witchcraft. That's also appears to be true, and she got herself out of that too. And so when you're faced with those facts as an actress, I just thought, okay, this is one clever person, and a clever political person is somebody who's not rash, somebody who doesn't lash out, somebody who doesn't go, you know, say the first thing that comes into their head. It's somebody who thinks about things and then thinks, all right, where can we go from here? How can I turn this to our advantage? If you add to that the fact that she was very well, people spoke kindly of her, then you have to think that she was, and she was very close to all her children, then you have to consider that she was probably a kind person also. So those were the two facts that I took and attempted to fill in the rest with my own imagination. Sometimes I think if you have too many things that you know about somebody, or if you're playing somebody that everybody knows about, an incredibly famous person, I think that's much more difficult, because an audience have to forget what they already know or what they think they know about the very famous person you're playing in order to believe that you are that person. So it is easier.
And you've had some of that, you know, some of those very well-known historical figures as well in your career. You played Mary Stuart on stage. You were Clementine Churchill in Into the Storm. Was that very much more trying to capture a much more well-known and well-studied historical figure, less room for your personal interpretation?
No, I think there's always room for your personal interpretation, but I think what's difficult about, I mean, if they've been ancient history like Mary Stuart or Jacquetta Woodville, or again, it's much easier. If it's somebody like, you know, Lady Churchill, that's harder, because there are people living who knew her, you know, still know her. People still living who knew her, sorry. So you're dealing with trying to portray somebody who is fresher in certain people's memory. And again, you only have, when somebody's been written about a great deal, again, you like Clemmy was, you're looking at various different people's interpretations of her. And so the fun, I found it great fun of doing somebody like Lady Churchill, is that you get to read them all and you go, what do they all have in common, all these people who are writing about her? What do they all have in common, and where do they differ? And what do they differ about, and why do they differ? So what's my interpretation of that? And then perhaps try and relate to the people who, actually that was also true with Mary Stuart, you know, particularly with characters from a long time ago. The history is often written by men and judged in a very different way. And although I did find that the one book that I liked the most was also written by a man, John Guy, who wrote a book about Mary Stuart. But I think that it was probably harder playing Clemmy than it was playing Mary Stuart as a character. But Mary Stuart was much harder because it was Schiller and it was on stage and it was for a long time, and that was much more tiring. So they're completely different challenges, but I'm not somebody who shies away from a challenge. I like a challenge.
Now, the miniseries does view the War of the Roses from the point of view of these very influential women in that period, and it's based on the novels by Philippa Gregory, and several of the writers on the miniseries are women. Do you think that gives a different perspective to, you know, not only the history of this era, but into history in general than we normally see? As you say, it's normally we normally see these stories told by and about men.
Definitely. Definitely. I mean, that's why Philippa writes about women, the women, because she feels, you know, as an incredibly knowledgeable person of the history of the time, she's always fascinated by forgotten women. And I think because it was a time when women really didn't have any power, really it was only the clever ones who used the power that they had in a I suppose you could call it a manipulative way or in a political way, but through the men or behind the men, or as in one of the scenes in the first episode of White Queen, for example, where the women all get together and have a little bit of a battle. I think women understand women, obviously, and there are certain elements of trying to imagine being a woman at that time. That's just that I guess women writers have clearly more access to, for obvious reasons. I wouldn't want to have 14 children, that's all I'm saying. Jacquetta had 14 children. I wouldn't want to have 14 children. So there's another fact. This is a woman who had 14 children. One of them definitely died, possibly two. The rest of them went on and lived their lives until they died in battle, or two, I think, were executed, and one became the queen. And and at the same time, she still carried on with this incredibly full political life. So she was clearly a woman, and she died probably in her 50s, probably somewhere around about 55-ish, 60, which at that time was very old. So she was clearly a woman blessed of great strength, physical strength, natural physical strength. She didn't succumb to all kinds of terrible things the way people could.
Now, but one thing I notice that the primary three women in this story, what they have in common is that the longer they survive through this very, fraught period, the more ruthless they sort of have to get, just to survive. Do you think they're sort of corrupted by the desire for power, or is it just really just a pure survival that they're just trying to get through without themselves and their families being killed?
That's a really interesting question, because a lot of the times, when you're portraying a character like that, who Elizabeth becomes queen, they then try and marry all of their family off, so that they oust the Warwicks, they get rid of the whatever leftover kind of enemy as they perceive them to be, to make their family stronger. And you have to ask yourself, why do they do that? Why do they continue to do that? When people are killed, when Jacquetta's husband and son are both beheaded by the Earl of Warwick and his crew without a trial, and why at no point does Jacquetta say, do you know what, this is just too tough, it's too horrid, I'd rather go and live in Wales and grow apples and have a nice time and live my nice life? They don't. So why don't they? They either don't because they don't have a choice, that they're not allowed to, or because they want to be powerful. And I think somewhere in there is probably the truth. I think it's probably a combination of both, rather, because I think taking on board their dynasty, this is my family, and I'm going to make my family as strong and as powerful as I possibly can. They're born into, obviously it wasn't as rigid as it became in later years, but the aristocracy, for want of a better phrase, wasn't really the aristocracy. They were, Baron Rivers was made a baron in order to because she married him. He wasn't a baron at all. So it was the Duke of Norfolk and all of it was all more randomly given out and more randomly taken away. It was much more precarious. But having said that, I'm not sure that at any point they could walk away. I think they might have tried. Clearly Jacquetta kept trying to go home, and then they'd be summoned back to court, and if they didn't go, they would be dragged off. So to a certain extent, they had no choice. But that's a very interesting. So somewhere in the middle is the truth, I think, where a little bit of both. That was a really rambling answer, wasn't it? Sorry about that.
No, it was great. The interesting thing is that, at the very beginning of this story, as we enter it in the miniseries, Elizabeth is struggling to raise her family. She's struggling just to make ends meet. And to a degree, it's a fairy tale that she gets to become Queen of England, and her family becomes powerful, but in a way that almost takes a larger toll on her than previous. Do you think she might have been better off as a commoner than she was as a queen?
Oh, without a shadow of a doubt. Of course. I mean, it was a brutal, brutal, brutal time. And one of the things when we were filming this was to try and imagine what it must be like to live in a time where there is no news. The only news that you get is some horseman riding as fast as he can to deliver a letter, which was probably sent yesterday or 3 days ago. And that the information in Wales was 2 weeks behind the information in, everything was very slow. But apart from that, people fighting, people warring, people wanting power meant that at any given time, whoever won was literally the difference between them turning up at your door and taking away everything you had and dragging you out in the street and possibly beheading you and raping your daughters and whatever, or you suddenly finding you've got a whole new land with more wealth and more power because your side won. It was a very, very, very brutal time. So without a shadow of a doubt, it would be nicer to go and live in a farm in Wales. But I'm just not sure they had much. It was war. It was constant war. England was at war for a long time.
Now, you as an actor, you seem equally, easy to transition more than most actors between stage, film, and TV work. Everything from Mary Stuart, A Doll's House, to Damages, and this, and Albert Nobbs. Is there a medium that you prefer, or do you love all of them? Do they appeal to you more or less equally?
I think the reason I've tried to do them all more or less equally is because I love them all more or less equally. They're all different. And I think if you have a long career, which I have luckily had and hopefully will continue to do so, then you have to keep changing, you have to keep challenging yourself, you have to keep doing new stuff. And I think if I were to do television all the time, or film all the time, or theatre all the time, I think I'd lose an edge. And I think that's why I enjoy doing, I enjoy changing very much so the medium that I work in. I've more or less always gone from theatre, television, film, like that, in a little sort of cycle, really. I love it. I've always enjoyed the change. I would find it very difficult to do something for a very long time in the same place.
Now,
I'm a gypsy.
One of our chatters, one of our chatters in our chat room is just mentioning how much she loves your work in The White Queen, and points out specifically the courtroom scene. He says it's spot on and very true. What was it like filming that moment of one of Jacquetta's really biggest moments of defiance against against the people who were trying to attack her? Yeah.
It was great. I mean, it's always really good fun to have really chewy scenes that you can get your teeth into and pull them about and have fun with. And luckily, James Frayne is such a fabulous actor that we just really enjoyed playing off each other, and it was great. They're hard work, those scenes, because you have to maintain a very tight level of tension, because she was terrified. I mean, she must have been terrified. So to keep that kind of tight kind of energy and then control yourself over the energy is a hard thing to do. It's a tiring thing to do. It's more physical than you'd think, when you're actually trembling. But actors live for those kind of scenes. They're the best kind of scenes.
Another of our chatters wants to know...
Especially when you have somebody lovely like James to play opposite, who's just great.
Another of our chatters wants to know if you wished that there had been more, maybe of Jacquetta's backstory included in the film before we kick off with the story of Elizabeth and Edward.
At one point, I think there was talk of seeing them being arrested and thrown out of, which is what had happened before at some point, but you know, it wasn't necessary to the story. And I think what was nice about the way my character starts in the first episode is that she's, you know, she's seemingly very together, and very kind of, you slowly realize that she's actually really pretty manipulative. And so I don't think necessarily in this particular tale her backstory is of interest, since this is a story about the White Queen. So it's about my influence on the White Queen. I think if they went back and did a whole different story about Jacquetta, that would be a whole different film.
And do you think there's, I mean, you know, there must be a whole, you know, you could make this entire 10-episode miniseries just about her or just about any one of these people. There's so much rich material there.
Yeah, absolutely. You could. That's what I think. You're absolutely right. You've said it already. You can't. You know, would it be nice? But then, yes, it would be nice to then go on and do a 10-part series about Richard, or a 5-part series about, you know, I don't know, the Duke of York. I mean, you could do them about any of them because they're all so interesting and so fascinating.
Well, I want to thank you very much for talking with me today. I want to wish you the best of luck at the Emmys, where you could potentially be nominated, as you were nominated at the Golden Globes for the White Queen.
That's very kind of you to think of that. Thank you.
Have a good day.
Very nice to talk to you. Bye-bye.